Well, hello there, little friend.
The greatest jest is believing the truth is a lie.
The English Middle Ages, a time when winter was not just a season, but a serious test. Cold, hunger, and darkness were constant companions. But even in these conditions, people found reasons for joy and celebration. Winter feasts were not just banquets, but important events in the life of society, where traditions, beliefs, and food were mixed together. It was a time when people gathered together to warm themselves by the fire, share food, and forget about the harshness of the world around them. Today, we will immerse ourselves in the world of winter feasts and traditions of the English Middle Ages. Learn what people ate and drank, how they entertained themselves, and what customs they observed. This is a story about how people fought the cold and darkness using the power of community and the joy of celebration. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how one of the most expensive and prestigious delicacies of the Middle Ages was associated with a bird that today is not food for us, but a symbol of beauty.
Oh, look, a swan.
Winter feasts were not spontaneous events. They were carefully planned and held at specific times and places. Most often, these were castles, large estates, or abbeys, where there was enough space for a large number of guests. The main winter holiday was, of course, Christmas, which in the Middle Ages was celebrated for 12 days. It was a time when work stopped and people gathered to celebrate. The venue for the feast, or, as it was called, the banquet hall, was the largest room in the castle or manor. Its walls were decorated with tapestries, which not only served as decoration, but also helped to keep the room warm. In the center of the hall was a large hearth that warmed the guests and lit up the space. The tables were long and made of wood. There were not enough seats at the table, so the guests sat on benches. Winter feasts were not just banquets, but events where everyone had their place and their role. A person's position in society depended on where they sat. Guests were seated according to rank, starting with the lord and his family, who sat at a high table on a raised platform. This seating arrangement was not just a symbol, but part of a strict etiquette that was strictly observed. Guests who sat closer to the lord were considered more honorable.
We are exactly where we belong.
Preparations for the feast began several months in advance. The lord's servants went into the forest to gather firewood. Then they collected berries, mushrooms, and herbs. Hunters caught game, and fishermen caught fish. Everything was gathered and stored in cellars and barns. Preparing the banquet hall was even more complicated. The Lord's servants cleaned and decorated the hall. They hung tapestries depicting scenes from the Lord's life on the walls. These tapestries were not just decorations, but symbols of wealth and power. They also helped to keep the room warm, which was very important. Lighting the banquet hall was one of the most difficult tasks. In the Middle Ages, there was no electricity, and the only sources of light were candles and torches. Candles were made from wax or tallow. They were very expensive, so they were used sparingly. A large number of candles were used at banquets, which were placed on tables and walls. This created a festive atmosphere and made the hall more cozy. The amount of food and drink at a banquet was enormous. To feed all the guests, a large amount of meat, bread, vegetables, and fruit was required. All this food was prepared in a large kitchen, which was located away from the banquet hall. The cooks worked day and night to prepare all the dishes. What do you think was the most difficult part of organizing such large feasts, given the lack of modern technology? Write about it in the comments. Medieval feasts were simple but very high in calories. The main food was bread, which was baked from rye or barley flour. It was coarse but very nutritious. Rich people ate white bread made from wheat flour, which was a symbol of wealth. For them, it was not just a food, but a sign of their status, as wheat was much more expensive and difficult to grow than rye or barley. Bread was often served in large, round loaves that were cut right at the table. Meat was the main dish at feasts. It was roasted on a spit over an open fire, which gave it a special taste and aroma. The most popular types of meat were beef, lamb, and pork. Poultry, such as geese and ducks, were also roasted whole. Cooking meat was a real art. Cooks had to be able to calculate the cooking time correctly so that the meat was not raw inside and burnt on the outside. To do this, they used special tools such as long skewers and tongs to turn the meat. Spices were very expensive and rarely used, so herbs grown in gardens were used to add flavor. The main seasonings were salt, pepper, garlic, and onions. However, on the tables of the aristocracy, one could find dishes seasoned with ginger, cinnamon, and even saffron, which gave the dishes a bright color. These spices were brought from distant countries, and their cost was so high that only the wealthiest could afford them. In addition to meat, porridge made from grains, vegetables, and fruits were served at feasts. Vegetables such as cabbage and turnips were available year-round and were used in soups and stews. Fruits such as apples and pears were stored in cellars. Fish was also an important dish, especially during fasting days. It was salted or smoked to preserve it for a long time. The most popular types of fish were herring, cod, and carp. They were served in various ways: fried, boiled, or baked. Some dishes were very unusual. For example, pâté made from game were very popular. They were made from wild boar, deer, or hare meat. Pâté were very high in calories and nutritious, and were served at feasts to show the wealth and generosity of the Lord. At medieval feasts, the food was simple but very high in calories. The main food was bread, which was baked from rye or barley flour. It was coarse but very nutritious. Rich people ate white bread made from wheat flour, which was a symbol of wealth. Would you agree to a life where the only variety in food was different types of meat? Have you ever thought that for some it was a feast, but for others it was hard work? We will talk about this further in the chapter on the role of servants. At medieval feasts, servants played no less important a role than the guests. Servants, or carvers as they were called, were responsible for carving meat. This was a very important task that required great skill and dexterity. Carvers not only had to be able to cut meat correctly, but also to do so beautifully in order to impress the guests. Wine pourers were responsible for serving drinks. They had to make sure that every guest always had a full cup. Wine pourers also had to know which drinks to serve with which dishes. It was not just a skill, but a real art. Trumpeters were another important part of the staff. They blew trumpets to announce the start of the feast, the serving of each new dish, and the arrival of important guests. This was not just an announcement, but part of the ceremony that gave the feast a special status. In addition to these main roles, there were many other servants at feasts, each of whom performed their own function. For example, table managers were responsible for organizing the entire feast. They made sure that the food was served on time, that the guests were satisfied, and that everything went according to plan. It was a very responsible job that required not only organizational skills, but also the ability to make quick decisions in difficult situations. Falconers also had their place at the feast. They brought their falcons or hawks into the hall to show them to the guests. Falcons were a symbol of status and power, and their presence at the feast was a sign of wealth. Falconers also talked about their falcons and their abilities, which was very interesting for the guests. Minstrels were another important part of the feast. They were not just musicians, but a kind of chroniclers who told stories and sang songs about heroic deeds and love. They played lutes, flutes, and drums, creating a festive atmosphere. Minstrels could also improvise, which made their performances unique. Jesters were perhaps the most unusual members of the entourage. They told jokes, performed magic tricks, and played pranks on the guests. Jesters were not just entertainers, but important members of society. They could say what others dared not, and were a kind of conscience for the Lord. A jester could criticize the Lord and get away with it. This was a unique phenomenon that demonstrated that even in a strict hierarchical society, there was room for freedom of speech. All these people worked together to create an unforgettable celebration. Their work was hard, but it was necessary for the feast to be a success. The satisfaction of the guests depended on their skill and craftsmanship. And although they did not sit at the table with the lords, their role was no less important than that of the guests themselves. They were a real, well-oiled machine, every detail of which was important. Without them, the feast would have been just a chaotic gathering of people. Their work began long before the guests arrived and continued until the very end, when the hall was empty. It was thanks to their efforts that the Lord could relax and enjoy the company without worrying about the little things. They were the invisible heroes who created the magic of the holiday. In order to have fresh food in winter, the settlers built earthen cellars. They dug them deep into the ground, reinforced the walls with boards, and covered them with earth. This ensured a constant temperature and humidity, which was ideal for storing vegetables, fruits, and even meat. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, apples, and pears were stored in the cellars. They also kept cheese and smoked meat there. The cellar was not just a place to store food, but a real lifesaver in the winter months when it was impossible to get fresh food. The life of the settlers was closely connected with the rhythms of nature. Each season dictated its own rules, and winter was the harshest test. Long before the ground froze, active preparations began. People harvested crops, dried herbs, salted meat, and prepared everything that could help them survive the long months of cold and snow. The cellar became the heart of every home, its secret treasure trove, where the fruits of their labor and hopes for survival were stored. Building a cellar was a family affair. The men dug a deep hole, while the women and children helped carry out the earth. The walls were reinforced with thick planks to prevent collapse, and the floor was covered with straw to protect the food from damp. A wooden floor was built on top, which was covered with a layer of earth and snow, creating a kind of natural thermos. The entrance to the cellar was usually small, sometimes covered with a thick door or even just a piece of tarpaulin. The cellar had a special atmosphere. It always smelled of earth, fresh vegetables, and smoke from smoked meats. Going down into the cellar in the middle of winter was like traveling to another world. From the frosty air, you entered a cool but not icy space where it was always quiet and peaceful. On shelves carved into the earthen walls, rows of root vegetables lay neatly wrapped in burlap: potatoes, carrots, and turnips. In the far corners stood barrels of sauerkraut and pickled cucumbers, which added much-needed vitamins to the diet. Smoked ham hocks and bundles of sausages hung from hooks under the ceiling, and ripe apples and pears lay in woven baskets, retaining their aroma until spring. The cellar was not just a storage room, it was a symbol of foresight and survival. Every family was proud of its supplies, and their volume directly reflected the prosperity and skill of the owners. Children knew that without a cellar, it was impossible to survive the winter, and they treated it with great respect. Only adults were allowed to go in, and each visit was a whole ritual. The father or mother would carefully descend the wooden stairs, lighting the way with a kerosene lamp, and select the best vegetables for dinner. A special place was reserved for holiday preparations. It was in the cellar that the ingredients for Christmas dinner and Easter cake waited for their moment. The most valuable foods were stored here: special types of cheese, dried fruit for baking, and bottles of homemade wine or cider. These supplies were untouchable until a special occasion. They served as a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life goes on and there is reason for joy and celebration. Every trip to the cellar was a reminder of how much work went into every kilogram of food. It taught us to appreciate every fruit of the earth, every second of the warm season when we could work and build up our reserves. At times when snowstorms covered everything and it was impossible to go outside, the cellar became the only link to the outside world. a world they had created and preserved for themselves. But what happens to these supplies when the biggest holiday of the year arrives? And most importantly, how do they manage to hide the Christmas pudding from the children so that they don't eat it before it's time? Watch this video to the end to find out the answer.
Do you think it's ready yet? I can hear you too.
Christmas pudding was one of the main dishes at feasts. It was prepared several weeks before the holiday. Dried fruits, nuts, spices, and even meat were added to it. The pudding was cooked for several hours in a special cloth. It was very dense and high in calories. Christmas pudding was not just food, but a symbol of the holiday. A small coin was added to it, and whoever found it was considered lucky and could make a wish. For immigrants, Christmas was a time when work took a back seat and family traditions and memories of their homeland came to the fore. It was one of the few times of the year when they could afford luxury and abundance, albeit modest by today's standards. And at the center of this celebration, of course, was Christmas pudding. The tradition of making pudding was sacred. It was usually done by women, who began preparations long before the holiday itself. It was a long and laborious process that required patience and diligence. First, all the ingredients were mixed together. Dried fruits such as raisins and dried apricots, which had been carefully dried in the summer, nuts gathered in the forest, and fragrant spices brought from far away. Some recipes even included smoked meat or lard to make the pudding more filling and nutritious. The whole family participated in the process, stirring the mixture with wooden spoons. It was believed that everyone who touched the pudding would bring a piece of their luck to it. The pudding was then wrapped in a special linen or cotton cloth, tied tightly and placed in boiling water. It was cooked over low heat for many hours, sometimes up to 12. This process filled the house with an incredible aroma that spread far beyond its walls. People passing by immediately understood that Christmas preparations were underway in this house. The finished pudding was very dark, almost black in color, and had a dense, heavy texture. It was so high in calories that a small piece could replace an entire meal. In addition to being a delicious dish, the pudding had a deep symbolic meaning. It was not just food, but a hope for future prosperity and abundance. Each ingredient had its own meaning. Spices symbolized wealth, dried fruits symbolized abundance, and the dark colors symbolized the long winter nights that would soon come to an end. The most important tradition was to add a small silver coin to the pudding. The coin was carefully washed and hidden in the dough before it was sent to be cooked. Whoever got the piece with the coin was considered truly lucky. They could make a secret wish, which the settlers believed would definitely come true in the coming year. Finding the coin was a real event and always caused joyful laughter and cheers at the table. It was a fun and touching competition that brought the whole family together, young and old alike. After the pudding had cooled, it was stored in a cool place until Christmas. Sometimes it was doused with brandy or rum and set alight before being served. The burning blue flames added magic to the festive dinner and delighted the children. This spectacle symbolized the light of Christmas, which dispels darkness and cold. Christmas pudding was more than just food. It was a symbol of endurance and celebration, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, it is possible to find joy and a reason to celebrate. It was a link to the past, to the traditions of ancestors, and a promise of a better future for new generations. For the settlers, it became a symbol of a new home and a new beginning, which they built with their own hands step by step, while preserving a piece of their old native culture. Thus, Christmas pudding became an integral part of their new life. It united the past and the future, labor and joy, creating a bridge between the old and new worlds. It was sweet but dense and substantial, just like the lives of the settlers themselves. In addition to food and drink, there were also games at the feast. One of the most popular games was Blind Man's Buff. Participants were blindfolded and had to find an object that was hidden in the hall. Another popular game was wolf and sheep, where one person was the wolf and the rest were sheep. The goal of the wolf was to catch the sheep. These games helped people relax and have fun. They were simple but very entertaining. Games were part of the festive ritual that helped people forget about the harshness of life. Holidays for settlers were not only a time for abundant meals, but also a long-awaited opportunity to rest from exhausting work, relax, and have fun. When evening came and the tables were cleared, the house was filled with ringing laughter and shouts. It was time for games. These entertainments were simple, requiring no special equipment or inventory, but they were incredibly fun and exciting. They brought everyone together, young and old, erasing age boundaries and social differences. One of the most popular games was Blind Man's Buff. The rules were ridiculously simple, but that was the whole point. A participant was blindfolded with a thick bandage and had to find a specific object hidden somewhere in the room, relying only on hearing and touch. The other players gave hints, confused him, laughed, and directed him in different directions. Often the search ended with the player bumping into chairs, crashing into walls, or simply wandering around in circles for a long time, causing everyone present to burst into laughter. Another favorite game was Wolf and Sheep. It was especially popular among children, although adults often enjoyed playing it as well. One person was designated the wolf, and everyone else became sheep. The wolf stood in the center of the room, and the sheep scattered in different directions, hiding behind furniture, under tables, and in dark corners. The task of the wolf was to catch the sheep, and the sheep had to avoid being caught. This game turned the house into a real maze full of surprises and fun. Games were not just entertainment. They served an important social function. They helped relieve the tension that had built up over long months of hard work and strengthened community ties. People who had worked hard all year long laughed and competed together, forgetting their difficulties. There were no real losers in these games because the main goal was not to win, but to communicate and have fun. Sometimes, when a large group gathered, they would organize real competitions. For example, strength competitions. Men would measure their strength by competing in tug-of-war or lifting heavy objects. Women and girls would compete in dexterity, such as who could weave a basket or embroider a pattern faster. Such competitions were not only fun, but also a way to demonstrate one's skills and abilities, which was very important in a community of settlers, where every craftsman was valued. Of course, the main prize in such games was not a material thing, but the respect and admiration of those around them. But sometimes the winners were rewarded. It could be an extra piece of Christmas pudding, which was considered a special treat, or a specially baked cake. However, the most valuable reward was the recognition and joy that victory brought not only to the winner, but to his entire family. These simple but sincere games were what made the holidays truly special. They helped people forget about the harshness of life, the difficulties and hardships they faced every day. Games were part of a festive ritual that gave them hope and faith in a better future. And what prize awaited the winner? Another pudding, or perhaps the most precious treasure of all, an extra hour of sleep after the festive night? Not at all. Extra entertainment. Let's talk about that next.
More music, more jokes, more games. Let's go!
Music was an important part of feasts. Minstrels performed at feasts, playing lutes, flutes, and drums. They sang ballads, songs about love, and heroic deeds. Music was not just entertainment, but a way to pass on stories and traditions. In addition to minstrels, jesters also performed at feasts. They told jokes and performed magic tricks. Jesters were not just entertainers, but important members of society. They could say what others did not dare to say, and were a kind of conscience for the Lord. The settlers' festive feasts were a real spectacle, filled not only with food and games, but also with music and entertainment. In those days, when there was no radio or television, music and the performing arts played a huge role in people's lives, bringing them together and filling their hearts with joy. They were an integral part of every celebration, from the most modest family dinner to a large community festival. The main heroes of the holidays were, of course, the minstrels. These wandering musicians and poets were true guardians of culture. They traveled from settlement to settlement, bringing with them not only music, but also the latest news, gossip, and stories. At feasts, they played simple but expressive instruments. The lute, which resembles a modern guitar, the flute, whose sounds resembled birdsong, and drums, which set the rhythm for the celebration. Their music was so soulful that it made you want to dance, sing, or just listen with your eyes closed. The minstrels performed a wide variety of pieces. Among them were ballads that told of distant lands and the adventures of heroes, songs about love and romantic experiences, as well as heroic tales of feats and battles. These songs were not just entertainment, but a living chronicle. They passed on traditions, historical events, and moral values from generation to generation. Listening to them, people felt part of a great, shared past and future. But it wasn't just minstrels who entertained the people. Jesters were also important participants in feasts. Their role in society was unique and much more significant than it might seem at first glance. They were professional entertainers, capable of making even the most serious people laugh. Jesters told jokes and funny stories, performed magic tricks and juggled, and put on small shows that always attracted a crowd. However, jesters were not just clowns. They were a kind of voice of the people and sometimes the conscience of the Lord. In a society with a strict hierarchy, the jester was the only person allowed to speak the truth, even the most bitter. Behind their masks of foolishness and buffoonery, they could criticize the authorities, mock stupidity and injustice without risking punishment. Their words, spoken with a smile, made people think and sometimes even make important decisions. It was their special gift to speak the truth in such a way that it was heard but did not cause anger. Music and entertainment at feasts were not just background noise, but an integral part of the festive ritual. They created a special atmosphere of unity and joy that helped people forget the harsh realities of life. Melodies and songs evoked memories of their native lands and loved ones they had left behind. Anecdotes and jokes told by jesters helped relieve the tension that had built up over long months of hard work. Thus, festive feasts were not just a banquet, but a full-fledged cultural event. They allowed people not only to enjoy delicious food and communication, but also to receive spiritual nourishment. Music and entertainment were what made the holidays truly lively and memorable, giving people hope and faith in a better future. They reminded us that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit remains strong, and joy and fun are always to be found if there is someone to share them with.
To lands of ice and snow.
I declare a feast for all.
To the king.
Lighting was a very important element of feasts. In the Middle Ages, there was no electricity, and the only sources of light were candles and torches. Candles were made from wax or tallow. They were expensive, so they were used sparingly. A large number of candles were used at feasts, which were placed on tables and walls. This created a festive atmosphere and made the hall more cozy. In addition to candles, torches were used, which were fixed to the walls. They gave a bright but short-lived light. In an era when electricity was unheard of, light was not just a source of visibility, but a real luxury, a symbol of wealth and celebration. The festive feasts of the settlers were a vivid example of this. They transformed ordinary halls into shining spaces filled with mysterious and warm light. The main sources of lighting were candles and torches. For ordinary people, candles were a very expensive luxury, so they were used sparingly, mainly to light their homes during the hours of darkness. They were made from readily available materials, wax or tallow. Wax candles, although they burned longer and brighter, were rare and available only to the wealthiest families. Tallow candles were more common, but they often smoked and gave off an unpleasant odor. On holidays, however, everything changed. To create a festive atmosphere, the settlers spared no candles. They were placed everywhere, on tables and specially forged candlesticks, on windowsills and even on the walls. The multitude of small lights created a mesmerizing sight. Their soft, flickering light enveloped the hall, making it cozy and festive. Shadows danced on the walls and people's faces seemed mysterious and spiritual. This light transformed an ordinary meal into a real magic. In addition to candles, torches were also used. They provided a brighter and stronger light, which was necessary for illuminating large spaces. The torches were fixed to the walls in special holders. They were made of tarred wood or fabric soaked in fat and burned with a crackling sound, filling the air with the smell of smoke. Although torches were not as long-lasting as candles, their bright flames were an integral part of the festive atmosphere. They created a sense of grandeur and significance. Lighting was not just a functional element. It had a deep symbolic meaning. The multitude of candles symbolized the light of Christmas, hope, and joy. On dark and cold winter nights, candlelight reminded us that even in the harshest times, there is always room for light and warmth in life. It was a symbol of unity and celebration, bringing people sitting at the same table together and making them part of a big, bright event. Light also played an important role in festive games and entertainment. In the dim light of candles and torches, shadows became longer and more bizarre, adding mystery and fun. Children played blind man's buff, relying on their hearing and senses, while adults engaged in leisurely conversations, immersed in soft light. Minstrels and jesters performing in this flickering light seemed even more mysterious and talented. Thus, lighting at feasts was not just a technical necessity, but an important element that created an atmosphere of celebration and magic. It transformed an ordinary hall into a fairy tale place where everyone felt part of something big and meaningful. In this light, people forgot their difficulties and enjoyed the moment of joy and unity. The light of candles and torches was not just a source of visibility, but a symbol of hope, warmth, and celebration that remained forever in the memory of every participant. Many dishes at feasts had symbolic meanings. For example, Christmas goose was a symbol of wealth and abundance. It was expensive and not everyone could afford it. Therefore, when it was served at the table, it was a sign of prosperity. Christmas pudding, which was a symbol of the holiday, also had its own meaning. Its round shape symbolized the sun, and dried fruits symbolized the harvest. It was a reminder that spring always follows winter. Festive feasts for settlers were not just banquets. They were rituals filled with deep meaning, where each dish had its own symbolic significance. Food was not only a source of nourishment, but also a reflection of their hopes, beliefs, and connection to nature. Every bite contained a hint of the past and a promise of the future. The main dish served at Christmas was, of course, Christmas goose. It was a real luxury, not available to everyone. Goose was a symbol of wealth and abundance. For settlers who ate simple food all year round, the appearance of such a delicacy on the table was a real event. It meant that the family was prosperous, that the harvest had been bountiful, and that their labor had not been in vain. Roast goose with a crispy crust and an appetizing aroma of herbs and spices was not just food, but the embodiment of their dreams of a better life. It was a reminder that their efforts to build a new home had been crowned with success. Another important symbol was Christmas pudding. Its round shape had a deep meaning. It symbolized the sun gradually returning to the sky, promising the end of the long, cold winter days. The dried fruits that filled the pudding represented the harvest and fertility. It was a reminder that nature is cyclical and that spring always follows winter. The pudding was a kind of talisman that was supposed to bring good luck and a good harvest to the house in the coming year. But other dishes also had their own symbolism. For example, bread was the staple of the table. It was a symbol of life and survival. In those days, when food was sometimes worth its weight in gold, every piece of bread was precious. Breaking bread and sharing it with neighbors was a sign of friendship and solidarity. Bread baked for holidays often had a special shape, such as ears of wheat or the sun, which also symbolized fertility and harvest. Even the simplest foods, such as apples and nuts, had their own significance. Apples, which were stored in cellars, symbolized the fruits of labor and health. They were eaten throughout the winter to strengthen the body and ward off disease. Nuts, which were gathered in the forest, were a symbol of abundance and endurance. They were a source of strength and energy in difficult times. By crushing the shells, people seemed to be fighting against difficulties, and the delicious kernel was a reward for their efforts. Food at feasts also symbolized unity and community. When the whole family and neighbors gathered around the table, they shared not only food, but also their stories, joys, and sorrows. Eating together strengthened their bonds, reminding them that they were not alone in this harsh world. Each dish, prepared with love and care, was a manifestation of this community. Thus, festive dishes were much more than just food. They were guardians of traditions, symbols of hope and faith in the future. Each bite carried a message about the value of work, the cyclical nature of nature, and the strength of the human spirit. These symbols helped the settlers not to lose hope and to believe that even after the longest and harshest winter, spring would surely come.
To our success after a year of hard work.
To our success.
The feast ended when all the guests were full. The guests rose from the tables and thanked the Lord. After that, they dispersed to their homes. But some guests, especially those who had come from far away, stayed overnight in the castle.
Indeed.
The end of the feast was not just the end of the banquet, but the end of the holiday. After that, the work week began. People returned to their duties, but the vivid image of the holiday remained in their memories, helping them survive the harsh winter. The long-awaited feast, like a bright flash in the harsh winter, was coming to an end. The air, which had recently been filled with laughter, music, and the aroma of festive food, gradually became quieter. It was a special moment, full of joy and a touch of sadness. The guests, well-fed and satisfied, began to disperse little by little, leaving behind warm memories. As was customary, the guests rose from the tables to thank the Lord for his hospitality and generous hospitality. This was not just a formal gesture, but a sincere expression of gratitude. The Lord in turn thanked everyone for sharing the holiday with him and wished them all the best. It was a moment of unity and mutual respect that emphasized the importance of the community. After mutual thanks, the guests began to disperse to their homes. Those who lived nearby set off on their way, lighting their path with homemade torches or lanterns. Their voices, full of impressions and cheerful mood, gradually faded into the silence of the night. The journey home was not just a return, but a transition from the world of celebration to the world of everyday concerns. The situation was different for guests who had come from far away. They had no need to hurry. They stayed overnight in the castle or in neighboring houses, enjoying the last moments of festive conversation. They shared stories, laughed at the jesters' jokes, and listened to the minstrels' last ballads. For them, the feast continued, but in a more intimate and warm atmosphere, allowing them to feel part of a large family.
Must be careful not to attract attention.
The end of the feast was not just the end of the banquet, but the end of the holiday as a whole. Tomorrow was no longer a day off, but the beginning of the work week. The men returned to their business, the women to their household chores, and the children to their duties. Life returned to its usual course, filled with hard physical labor and harsh realities. But in their memories and their hearts, a vivid image of the holiday remained. This image was a kind of spiritual fuel that helped them survive the long and harsh winter. They remembered the taste of Christmas goose, the smell of gingerbread cookies, cheerful laughter, and music. These memories were like a ray of light on the darkest and coldest days. They reminded them that after hard work and hardship, there is always time for rest and joy. that life is not only a struggle, but also a celebration. The feast, with its abundant food, fun games, and heartfelt conversation, gave people hope. It showed that even in the harshest times, they could come together, celebrate their achievements, and remind themselves of the importance of family and community. It was not just a temporary respite, but a symbol of endurance and resilience. Thus, the end of the feast was not a sad event, but the completion of a cycle. It was a moment when people took with them not only memories of delicious food and fun, but also a charge of positive energy that helped them look to the future with optimism. This holiday was a kind of reboot for them, giving them strength for new achievements and helping them overcome all the difficulties that still lay ahead. Winter feasts were not just banquets, but important events in the life of the community. They helped people cope with difficulties, feel part of the community, and simply have fun. It was a time when people gathered together to warm up, share food, and forget about the harshness of the world around them.
Prosperity.
We have come a long way from preparing winter supplies in the cellar to enjoying festive feasts. But all these chapters are only part of one big story, a story of survival, strength of spirit, and human community. Winter feasts were not just banquets. They were real rituals that helped people not only survive, but also remain human. Which aspect of winter feast do you find most unusual? Write about it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos.